There is a truth that almost no one has the courage to face, because acknowledging it dismantles an entire narrative that has been carefully constructed over time. It is far more comfortable to believe that the problem lies in a lack of faith, insufficient effort, unanswered prayers, or even some hidden moral failure. Those explanations preserve a certain structure. They offer something external to fight against. But the real discomfort emerges when you realize that none of those explanations fully account for what is happening. The discomfort begins when you perceive that there is a quiet contradiction operating within you every single day, so subtle, so automatic, that it rarely reaches conscious awareness. You believe, you say you trust, you rely on words, promises, scriptures, and yet, at the same time, you think, imagine, and anticipate outcomes as someone who already expects the same results as always. That is where everything quietly locks up. This is not mysticism. It is not symbolic language meant to sound profound. And it is not a spiritual accusation. Jesus addressed this directly, but almost no one noticed. Most people were too busy trying to believe more, do more, say more. They assumed the issue was intensity, but it never was. The issue was always direction. You can move forward with great force, but if internally you are walking in the opposite direction, nothing truly progresses. Strength does not compensate for misalignment. Effort does not override contradiction. And faith, when divided internally, cannot sustain movement for long. There is a silent point within the mind where real decisions are made, not the place of spoken words, not the place of public declarations, but the place of internal images, the mental pictures you rehearse when no one is watching. That is where the conflict begins. You pray for change, yet imagine repetition. You ask for healing, yet think about the history. You speak of faith, yet mentally organize yourself for disappointment, as if preparing for impact. This does not happen because you want it to. It happens because this pattern was formed slowly, layer by layer, as a response to previous experiences. The mind learns what seems to protect it, and once learned, it repeats automatically. The problem is that no one taught you to observe this. You were taught to monitor behaviors, to correct speech, to adjust external attitudes. But almost no one spoke about the internal misalignment that forms when the mind learns to expect less, even while the mouth declares more. And this misalignment does not scream. It does not show up as explicit doubt. It appears as something neutral, almost reasonable. A thought that says, let's see what happens. But that let's see already carries a silent conclusion. You are not spiritually divided in the religious sense. This is not a battle between belief and unbelief as doctrines define them. What exists is an internal split between what you affirm and what you imagine, between what you ask for and what you actually expect. And as long as that split remains, nothing stabilizes for long. Not because God does not respond, but because yourself do not remain internally whole in the movement you begin. Jesus never treated faith as a force that needed to be increased. He never said the issue was quantity. His attention went deeper. He observed the internal point from which people moved. Often he did not correct the request, the language, or the ritual. He corrected the inner position from which it was born. Because adjusting the surface is meaningless when the foundation is in conflict. There is a significant difference between believing and being aligned. Belief can coexist with fear. Belief can coexist with fatigue. Belief can coexist with emotional struggle. But coherence cannot. Coherence demands that thought, expectation, and direction move together. When they do not, the mind begins to quietly sabotage every movement of faith, not out of malice, not out of sin, but out of conditioning. The mind learned over time that expecting less hurts less, so it protects you from hope by generating familiar scenarios. Repetition feels safer than possibility. This is one of the hardest prisons to recognize because it does not present itself as opposition. It presents itself as wisdom, as realism, as maturity. You begin to call balance what is actually preemptive surrender. And so you continue praying, you continue trying, you continue walking. But internally, you have already accepted the same outcome. That creates a strange internal state. You move, but you do not project yourself forward. You ask, but you do not open. You speak, but you do not sustain. Jesus warned about this in simple but profound terms. When he spoke of faith, he was not talking about emotional intensity. He was talking about wholeness, about not being divided within yourself, because internal division creates a short circuit. The energy that should move in one direction disperses. Decisions lose force, movement loses continuity. And then, once again, the person concludes, it didn't work. What makes this particularly subtle is that it happens rarely consciously. No one wakes up thinking, today I will sabotage my own faith. It happens because the mind repeats patterns that were once useful. Perhaps you believed deeply and were disappointed. Perhaps you hoped intensely and were crushed. Over time, you learned to believe with the brakes engaged, to expect cautiously, to desire with restraint. And this gradually became normal. But there is an invisible cost. Every time you ask for something while imagining the opposite, you reinforce the internal message that your words carry no weight. Not because words are powerless, but because they are unsupported internally. It's like stepping onto stones that shift beneath your feet. No matter how strong the step, the support is unstable. There is a silent point within the mind where real decisions are made. Not the place of spoken words, not the place of public declarations, but the place of internal images, the mental pictures you rehearse when no one is watching. That is where the conflict begins. You pray for change, yet imagine repetition. You ask for healing, yet think about the history. You speak of faith, yet mentally organize yourself for disappointment, as if preparing for impact. This does not happen because you wanted to. It happens because this pattern was formed slowly, layer by layer, as a response to previous experiences. The mind learns what seems to protect it, and once learned, it repeats automatically. The problem is that no one taught you to observe this. You were taught to monitor behaviors, to correct speech, to adjust external attitudes. But almost no one spoke about the internal misalignment that forms when the mind learns to expect less, even while the mouth declares more. And this misalignment does not scream. It does not show up as explicit doubt. It appears as something neutral, almost reasonable. A thought that says, let's see what happens. But let's see already carries a silent conclusion. You are not spiritually divided in the religious sense. This is not a battle between belief and unbelief as doctrines define them. What exists is an internal split between what you affirm and what you imagine, between what you ask for and what you actually expect. And as long as that split remains, nothing stabilizes for long. Not because God does not respond, but because you yourself do not remain internally whole in the movement you begin. Jesus never treated faith as a force that needed to be increased. He never said the issue was quantity. His attention went deeper. He observed the internal point from which people moved. Often, he did not correct the request, the language, or the ritual. He corrected the inner position from which it was born. Because adjusting the surface is meaningless when the foundation is in conflict. There is a significant difference between believing and being aligned. Belief can coexist with fear. Belief can coexist with fatigue. Belief can coexist with emotional struggle. But coherence cannot. Coherence demands that thought, expectation, and direction move together. When they do not, the mind begins to quietly sabotage every movement of faith. Not out of malice, not out of sin, but out of conditioning. The mind learned over time that expecting less hurts less, so it protects you from hope by generating familiar scenarios. Repetition feels safer than possibility. This is one of the hardest prisons to recognize because it does not present itself as opposition. It presents itself as wisdom, as realism, as maturity. You begin to call balance what is actually preemptive surrender. And so you continue praying, you continue trying, you continue walking, but internally you have already accepted the same outcome. That creates a strange internal state. You move, but you do not project yourself forward. You ask, but you do not open. You speak, but you do not sustain. Jesus warned about this in simple but profound terms. When he spoke about faith, he was not talking about emotional intensity. He was talking about wholeness, about not being divided within yourself, because internal division creates a short circuit. The energy that should move in one direction disperses. Decisions lose force. Movement loses continuity. And then, once again, the person concludes, it didn't work. What makes this particularly subtle is that it rarely happens consciously. No one wakes up thinking, today I will sabotage my own faith. It happens because the mind repeats patterns that were once useful. Perhaps you believed deeply and were disappointed. Perhaps you hoped intensely and were crushed. Over time, you learned to believe with the brakes engaged, to expect cautiously, to desire with restraint. And this gradually became normal. But there is an invisible cost. Every time you ask for something while imagining the opposite, you reinforce the internal message that your words carry no weight. Not because words are powerless, but because they are unsupported internally. It's like stepping onto stones that shift beneath your feet. No matter how strong the step, the support is unstable. This is the invisible prison few recognize. It is not the absence of faith. It is the constant coexistence with a thought that contradicts it. And as long as this thought remains unseen, it continues to operate silently, organizing expectations, influencing decisions, shaping reactions. It seeps into small choices, delays, internal concessions that seem harmless. And when the outcome fails to change, it presents itself as justification. I knew it. None of this means there is something wrong with you as a person. It does not mean you failed spiritually. It simply means there is an active pattern that has never been brought into awareness. And everything that remains unconscious continues to govern. Jesus never exposed these things to accuse. He exposed them to liberate. Because what is seen loses its power. What is named can no longer operate in the dark. Perhaps for the first time, you were beginning to notice that the conflict was never external. It was not the world. It was not the system. It was not the difficulty. The conflict was always the silent incoherence between what you affirm and what you imagine. And recognizing this is not an ending. It is a beginning. Because alignment is only possible once division is acknowledged. Till then, you keep trying to adjust behaviors, words, and practices without touching the real point where everything originates. That is why even with faith, effort, and prayer, the sensation of stagnation persists. It is not punishment. It is not a test. It is a signal that something within you is moving in another direction.
This understanding does not solve everything. It does not deliver a method, a technique, or a step-by-step process, but it opens a new internal space, a space where something begins to make sense, a space where struggle decreases because clarity increases. And that space must be explored carefully, because it is there that the sabotaging thought is born. And that is where your attention needs to rest. When this point begins to surface, something uncomfortable happens. Not guilt, not fear, but a kind of lucidity that dismantles old justifications. Because once you see it, you can no longer claim ignorance. You realize there is a place within the mind where real decisions are made, long before any word is spoken or any action taken. It is there that thought organizes itself, not as a clear sentence, but as a felt expectation, a subtle sense of how things usually end. This expectation does not emerge randomly. It is the product of repetition, of experiences accumulated but never digested, of disappointments endured but never understood. The mind, attempting to protect you from pain, learns to anticipate the worst as a form of control. If you expect little, it hurts less when little happens. This mechanism appears harmless, even prudent, but it carries a profound side effect. It neutralizes faith without ever confronting it directly. That is why so many people continue believing, continue praying, continue speaking the right words, yet feel that nothing moves. They are not in conflict with God, they are in conflict with themselves. The mouth moves in one direction, the imagination moves in another, and the imagination always arrives first. It prepares the internal ground upon which decisions rest. If that ground is marked by repetition, fear of expectation, and accumulated fatigue, every attempt at change encounters resistance. Jesus understood this with remarkable clarity. When he encountered people trapped in cycles, he did not amplify effort, he interrupted the pattern. He drew attention to the internal place from which the person was moving. Often this felt strange, even harsh. Why? Because while people wanted immediate solutions, he exposed incoherence, not to humiliate, but to align. Because alignment precedes transformation. There is a specific moment when faith stops functioning as intended, not when you openly doubt, but when you silently accept that nothing will change while continuing to affirm the opposite. This silent acceptance creates a subtle paralysis. You do not quit, but you do not fully commit. You do not abandon, but you do not advance. You remain suspended between desire and expectation, between asking and anticipating failure. This state is exhausting, not because of effort, but because of contradiction. It is like rowing with one arm pulling backward. Energy is expended, but progress is minimal. Over time, this produces spiritual fatigue, not because you were far from God, but because you were far from internal coherence. The most difficult part is that this pattern normalizes itself. You begin to live this way unconsciously. You label fear as maturity. You label resignation as realism. You label emotional distance as balance. And the less you expect, the less you engage. The less you engage, the less risk you feel. But also, the less life flows. Jesus never labeled this as sin. He called it blindness, an internal blindness, a failure to perceive the logic that governs one's own movement. This is why he said the truth sets free, not because truth is pleasant, but because it exposes the hidden mechanism directing behavior. What is seen cannot repeat automatically. When you begin to notice this pattern, the way you observe yourself changes. You start paying attention to the thoughts that follow prayer, the images that surface after a request, the silent conclusions formed before action begins. Often you realize those conclusions were present before the prayer even started. The prayer in those moments becomes an attempt to persuade something internally that has already decided. This realization should not produce guilt. Guilt reinforces the cycle. What must emerge is understanding, a calm, almost clinical observation that sees without judgment. This is how Jesus operated. He did not force change, he revealed incoherence. Because coherence cannot be forced, it must be understood. There is a deep reason the mind resists change even when faith desires it. Change demands abandoning familiar internal narratives. It requires surrendering the safety of low expectations. It demands facing the possibility of hoping and being disappointed again. That is more frightening than remaining in the familiar. So the mind prefers repetition, even painful repetition, over unfamiliar territory. Until this is seen, people continue believing the problem is external, God's timing, the process, the enemy, themselves, anything except the real place where everything is organized. And so the cycle repeats, the same prayer, the same restrained hope, the same outcome. each repetition strengthening the silent belief that nothing truly works. But what Jesus revealed is that the kingdom does not operate through isolated words. It operates through wholeness, through alignment between thought, expectation, and direction. When that alignment is absent, faith becomes a beautiful discourse sustained by a contradictory imagination, and no reality can stabilize when born from internal conflict. Perhaps now you are beginning to see that the problem was never the absence of faith, but the constant presence of a thought that contradicts it, a thought that does not appear as an enemy, but as protection. And as long as it remains active, every attempt at change will encounter resistance. This is the point that must be faced honestly, not to be fought, but to be understood. Because what you attempt to defeat through force merely hides. What you understand loses control. And this is where the next stage becomes unavoidable. To discover where this thought originates and why it returns, even when you decide to believe. There is always a reason a thought returns. Thoughts do not persist merely because they are true, nor because they are false. They persist because they serve a function. They fulfill a role within the internal system of the mind. And the thought that quietly contradicts your faith without ever openly opposing it exists because at some point in your history it helped you survive. This is the part most people never examine. They try to silence the thought. They try to rebuke it. They try to replace it with better language. But none of that addresses the reason it exists. And anything that has a reason will return until the reason is understood. This sabotaging thought did not appear randomly. It was formed, shaped, reinforced. It emerged during moments when hope was costly, when expectation led to pain, when believing fully felt unsafe. In those moments, the mind adapted. It learned to protect you not by destroying faith, but by restraining it. The mind is not designed to pursue truth at all costs. It is designed to reduce perceived threat. Emotional threat counts as real danger to the nervous system. Repeated disappointment registers as something to be avoided, so the mind develops strategies. One of the most effective strategies is anticipation. If I expect less, I suffer less. If I prepare for failure, I am not surprised. If I remain internally detached, I stay in control. This strategy works temporarily. It stabilizes you in the short term. It keeps emotional pain manageable. It gives you the illusion of mastery over outcomes. But over time, the same mechanism that protected you begins to imprison you. Because it does not turn itself off. The mind does not update patterns automatically. It repeats what once worked, even when it no longer serves you, even when it actively undermines what you now desire, even when your faith has grown beyond the moment that created the pattern. This is why intention alone does not resolve the conflict. You can decide to believe more. You can choose to pray harder. You can commit intellectually to faith. But the internal mechanism remains untouched unless it is observed. Jesus consistently addressed this level of the human experience. When he spoke of blindness, he was not referring to ignorance of doctrine. He was pointing to the inability to see the internal logic that governs one's actions. People could hear his words, agree with his teachings, admire his authority, and still remain internally unchanged. Because agreement does not equal alignment. Alignment requires awareness, and awareness requires slowing down enough to notice what the mind does automatically. There is a subtle but critical distinction here. The sabotaging thought is rarely a sentence. It is not usually something explicit like, "This will never work." That would be too obvious, too easy to challenge. Instead, it appears as a posture of restraint, a posture of caution, a posture of emotional distance. It shows up as a felt sense rather than a spoken belief, a quiet leaning away from expectation, a subtle bracing for disappointment, a reflexive preparation for the familiar ending. This is why it is so difficult to confront. You cannot argue with a feeling the same way you argue with an idea, and yet this feeling shapes everything. It shapes how much you engage. It shapes how deeply you commit. It shapes how long you persist. Before you act, before you speak, before you choose, this internal posture has already set the limits of your involvement. Jesus knew that transformation does not begin with behavior. It begins with perception, with seeing what was previously invisible. This is why he often asked questions that seemed unnecessary, questions that disrupted automatic responses, questions that forced people to look inward rather than outward. Do you want to be healed? Why are you afraid? What are you looking for? These were not informational questions. They were interruptive questions. They disrupted the internal narrative running in the background. Because the mind lives on narratives. Every person carries an internal story about how things tend to go, about what is possible, about what is safe to expect, about what usually happens when they try. This story is not consciously written. It is accumulated, formed by patterns, reinforced by repetition, and once established, it operates beneath awareness, quietly shaping choices. The sabotaging thought is not separate from this story. It is a product of it. You can think of it as a conclusion the mind reached long ago and never revisited. And conclusions, once reached, are rarely questioned unless something disrupts them. That disruption is what Jesus brought. Not reassurance, not encouragement alone, but disruption. He interrupted the assumption that the future must resemble the past. He challenged the idea that history defines possibility. He confronted the internal certainty that said, this is how it always ends. But he did not do this by force. He did it by exposure. Exposure is different from confrontation. Confrontation pushes against resistance. Exposure reveals it. When something is exposed, it becomes optional. Before exposure, it is automatic. This is why understanding where the sabotaging thought originates is essential. Without that understanding, you keep reacting to its effects without ever addressing its cause. Most people attempt to override the pattern with effort. They push harder, declare louder, commit more intensely. But this only increases internal tension. Why? Because effort applied against an unseen resistance creates strain. You feel like you're carrying something heavy, but you can't tell what it is. This is where spiritual fatigue comes from. Not from believing too much, but from believing against yourself. Faith was never meant to be sustained by internal conflict. It was meant to flow from internal coherence. When coherence is absent, faith becomes work. And work without alignment drains. Jesus never invited people into strain. He invited them into rest. But rest does not mean passivity. It means alignment. It means movement without internal friction. The friction you feel is information. It tells you something inside is pulling in another direction. That direction is not random. It points back to the moment or series of moments when expectation became dangerous. This is where the mind made a decision, not a conscious one, a survival decision. I will not expect fully again. I will not open completely again. I will not risk that level of disappointment again. That decision may have saved you once, but now it stands in the way. And the mind defends it fiercely, not because it is true, but because it is familiar. Familiarity feels safe. Jesus understood that people cling to familiar prisons more tightly than to unfamiliar freedom, because freedom introduces uncertainty. That is why exposure must be gentle. You cannot tear this pattern away. If you try, the mind will tighten its grip. It will generate anxiety. It will resist. This is not spiritual failure. It is nervous system logic. Transformation requires safety, and safety begins with understanding, not judgment. This is why guilt is so damaging in this process. Guilt frames the pattern as moral failure rather than learned adaptation, and the mind will not release something it believes is protecting you if it feels attacked. Jesus never shamed people out of blindness. He illuminated them out of it. Illumination allows choice. Once you see the pattern, you decide how much authority it has. Before that, it decides for you. This is the shift that begins in this stage. You move from being controlled by the pattern to observing it. Observation creates distance. Distance creates freedom. This is why Jesus emphasized seeing and hearing, not as physical acts, but as internal capacities, the ability to perceive what is happening within you. When perception changes, behavior follows naturally. This is not self-improvement, it is self-understanding. The mind cannot release what it does not understand, but once it understands why a pattern exists, it becomes willing to renegotiate it. This renegotiation does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, in moments where you notice the old posture arise and choose not to obey it automatically. This is subtle work. It happens when you pray and notice the image that follows, when you make a decision and feel the hesitation, when you sense yourself preparing for disappointment before anything has happened. In those moments, something new becomes possible. Not force, not denial, but choice. You begin to see that the thought is not you. It is something you learned. And what was learned can be unlearned, but only through awareness. Jesus never separated spiritual transformation from psychological clarity. The two are inseparable. The kingdom he spoke of begins within, and within means within the systems that govern thought, expectation, and reaction. Till those systems are seen, faith remains abstract, beautiful, sincere, but abstract. Once they are seen, faith becomes embodied, lived, integrated. This is why this stage feels unsettling. It removes excuses. It removes external explanations. It brings responsibility back to the place where power actually resides. Not responsibility in the sense of blame, but in the sense of agency. You are not responsible for the pattern forming, but you are responsible for whether it continues unconsciously. And responsibility without awareness is impossible. Awareness is what creates the possibility of response. This is the threshold. Most people never cross it. They remain fighting symptoms rather than understanding causes. They stay busy with effort because effort feels productive. But effort without clarity perpetuates exhaustion. Jesus did not come to exhaust people. He came to restore coherence. This is why he said his burden is light, not because life is easy, but because alignment removes unnecessary strain. When thought, expectation, and direction align, energy flows. When they do not, energy leaks. This stage is about locating the leak, not fixing it yet, not sealing it yet, just seeing where it is. That alone changes more than you realize. Because once you see the place where the mind pulls back, you stop mistaking resistance for reality. You stop assuming hesitation is wisdom. You stop calling fear maturity. You stop interpreting restraint as balance. You begin to see these things as signals, not commands. And that is the beginning of freedom. In the next stage, the focus shifts further inward, not to analyze endlessly, but to understand how this pattern continues to regenerate itself and how it can be gently dismantled without force. Because dismantling a protective pattern requires precision, not aggression. And that is where the real work begins. Once a pattern has been formed, it does not require effort to continue. It only requires invisibility. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of internal change. People assume that what controls them must be strong, aggressive, or actively resisting transformation. But the most powerful patterns do not fight, they simply repeat. Repetition feels natural, familiar, almost invisible. The sabotaging pattern you carry does not need to argue with your faith. It does not need to contradict your beliefs explicitly. It only needs to quietly shape how you engage with life. And it does this through a series of subtle, almost unnoticeable adjustments that occur long before conscious decisions are made. The pattern perpetuates itself by influencing three primary domains: attention, interpretation, and expectation. These three work together continuously, forming a closed loop. First, attention. The mind learns what to notice and what to ignore. Attention is never neutral, it is trained. Once a pattern has formed, attention begins to filter reality in ways that reinforce it. If your internal narrative expects repetition, your attention will gravitate toward evidence of sameness, toward confirmation, toward anything that supports the idea that nothing really changes. You may still notice positive moments, breakthroughs, or signs of progress, but they feel temporary, fragile, exceptions rather than indicators. The mind quietly classifies them as anomalies. Meanwhile, anything that resembles the old pattern receives disproportionate attention. A delay becomes proof. A setback becomes confirmation. A moment of uncertainty becomes evidence. This is not pessimism. It is pattern maintenance. Jesus spoke repeatedly about this when he talked about seeing. He pointed out that people look but do not perceive, not because nothing is there, but because attention has been trained to prioritize certain information over others. This is why two people can experience the same event and come away with entirely different conclusions. Attention determines interpretation. Which brings us to the second domain, interpretation. Interpretation is the meaning you assign to what you notice. It is the lens through which events are understood. Once the sabotaging pattern exists, interpretation begins to default toward familiar conclusions. Neutral events are interpreted cautiously. Ambiguous situations are interpreted defensively. Unclear outcomes are interpreted pessimistically. Not dramatically, subtly. A delayed answer becomes, "It's probably not going to happen." A partial improvement becomes, "This won't last." A new opportunity becomes, "I've seen this before." None of these interpretations feel extreme. They feel reasonable, balanced, mature. And that is precisely why they go unchallenged. The mind presents them as wisdom, not fear. Jesus often confronted this directly, not by changing circumstances, but by reframing interpretation. He challenged people's conclusions about what events meant. When he said things like, "You say this, but I tell you that," he was not correcting facts, he was correcting interpretation. Because facts do not control behavior, meaning does. And meaning is shaped by expectation. Which brings us to the third domain, expectation. Expectation is the silent forecast the mind holds about what will happen next. It is not something you declare, it is something you feel. Expectation shapes readiness. It determines how much you prepare, how much you risk, how much you invest emotionally. If you expect disappointment, you will not fully engage. Not because you choose not to, but because engagement feels unsafe. This expectation is rarely conscious. It exists as a background assumption. And once expectation is set, behavior follows automatically. You delay, you hesitate, you hold back. Not dramatically, just enough. These small adjustments seem insignificant, but they accumulate. Over time, they shape outcomes. And when outcomes match expectation, the pattern is reinforced. This is how it always goes. The loop closes. Attention confirms interpretation. Interpretation reinforces expectation. Expectation shapes behavior. Behavior influences outcome. Outcome feeds attention. And the cycle continues. This is not spiritual failure. It is cognitive emotional conditioning. Jesus did not treat this as rebellion. He treated it as captivity. This is why he spoke of people being bound, not sinful, blind, not evil, lost, not corrupt. Because captivity implies something holding you that you did not choose consciously. The tragedy is not that the pattern exists. The tragedy is that it goes unexamined. Because anything unexamined becomes law. Most people assume their internal reactions are simply how they are. They confuse familiarity with identity. They assume their internal posture is who they are, rather than something they learned. Jesus disrupted this confusion constantly. He separated the person from the pattern. You are not your fear. You are not your history. You are not your conclusions. But this separation cannot be grasped intellectually. It must be experienced through awareness. When awareness enters the loop weakens, not immediately, but inevitably. Because awareness introduces choice. The moment you notice what your attention is drawn to, you gain the ability to redirect it. The moment you notice how you interpret events, you gain the ability to question that interpretation. The moment you notice what you expect, you gain the ability to pause before obeying that expectation. This is why awareness is so threatening to the pattern. It does not destroy it through force, it dissolves it through exposure. The pattern thrives on automation. Awareness interrupts automation. Jesus never asked people to stop feeling fear. He asked them to notice it, to see it, to understand where it came from. Why are you afraid? This question is powerful because it shifts the person from being inside the fear to observing it. Once observed, fear changes. The same is true for expectation. Once you notice that you are preparing for disappointment, something loosens. You are no longer fully identified with that preparation. You do not have to fight it, you simply see it, and seeing changes everything. However, this stage can feel destabilizing because the pattern has provided a sense of predictability. Even if that predictability was painful, it was familiar. When awareness disrupts it, there is a moment of uncertainty. If I don't expect the worst, what do I expect? If I don't prepare for disappointment, how do I protect myself? This is where many people retreat. They mistake uncertainty for danger. But uncertainty is not danger. It is possibility. Jesus consistently invited people into this space, a space where the future was not dictated by the past, where the outcome was not pre-written. This is why faith feels risky. Not because it is irrational, but because it requires releasing control over imagined outcomes. The mind prefers control over truth. Control feels safe. Truth feels unknown. The sabotaging pattern offers control by limiting expectation. Faith invites openness by expanding it. This tension is not resolved through willpower. It is resolved through understanding. When you understand that the pattern's purpose was protection, not sabotage, your relationship to it changes. You stop treating it as an enemy. You start treating it as outdated information. Outdated information can be updated, but only when recognized. This is why Jesus emphasized renewal of the mind. Renewal is not replacement, it is revision. It is allowing new data to inform old conclusions. The mind cannot revise what it does not examine. This is where patience is essential. You are not dismantling a single thought, you are unraveling a system. Systems change slowly through consistent awareness. Every time you notice the old expectation arise and do not automatically follow it, you weaken the loop. Every time you interpret an event without defaulting to the familiar conclusion, you loosen the pattern. Every time you allow yourself to stay engaged a little longer than usual, you introduce new data. This new data challenges the old narrative, and narratives change only when contradicted by lived experience. Jesus created those experiences. He did not argue people out of their patterns. He invited them into moments that contradicted their expectations. Stand up. Stretch out your hand. Come and see. These invitations required participation before certainty. That is still the case. But participation does not mean forcing belief. It means staying present without retreating into the familiar. This is difficult because the mind will attempt to pull you back. It will remind you of past failures. It will warn you of disappointment. It will call caution wisdom. You do not need to argue with it. You only need to notice it. Noticing creates space, creates choice. Choice allows new movement. This is how the pattern weakens, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. When a pattern is no longer needed, it loses power. This stage is not about victory, it is about clarity. Clarity is quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply changes how you respond. You may notice you hesitate less. You may notice you stay engaged longer. You may notice you interpret events more openly. These are signs that alignment is beginning, not because you tried harder, but because you saw more clearly. Jesus always began there. In the next stage, we move even deeper into how alignment begins to form naturally once the pattern loosens, and why faith starts to feel lighter, less strained, and more coherent. There is a moment, often subtle, often quiet, when something inside you shifts. Not dramatically, not with emotion or certainty, but with a change in tension, a release that is almost imperceptible unless you're paying attention. This moment does not announce itself as victory. It does not feel like faith increasing. It feels like resistance decreasing. And that difference matters. Most people imagine transformation as an addition: more faith, more courage, more certainty, more effort. But what actually changes first is subtraction. Something stops pulling in the opposite direction. Alignment begins not with strength, it begins with relief. Relief from the constant internal negotiation, relief from having to convince yourself, relief from carrying two opposing expectations at once. This relief is not emotional excitement, it is coherence. For the first time, thought, expectation, and direction begin to move in the same general line. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough to be noticeable. This is why Jesus described his way as lighter, not because it eliminates difficulty, but because it removes unnecessary friction. Friction is what exhausts you. Friction comes from contradiction, from moving while resisting your own movement, from believing while preparing for disbelief, from hoping while rehearsing disappointment. When the pattern loosens, this friction diminishes, and suddenly, faith feels different. Not stronger, not louder, not more dramatic, just cleaner. It becomes less about proving something and more about participating in something. This is where many people become confused. They expect alignment to feel like confidence, but it rarely does at first. It feels like neutrality. You are no longer bracing for the familiar ending, but you are not yet certain of a new one. This in-between space can feel unsettling if you are accustomed to control, but it is actually the most fertile internal territory there is. Because for the first time, the future is not preloaded. Jesus consistently brought people into this space, a space where certainty was suspended, where outcomes were not predetermined by history, where the person had to move without guarantees. Follow me. Come and see. Take the step. None of these came with explanations of how things would turn out. This is not because Jesus valued blind risk. It is because alignment cannot form under pre-written conclusions. As long as you already know how things will end, nothing inside you needs to reorganize. You simply reenact the script. Alignment requires openness. Not optimism, not denial, openness. Openness means you are no longer internally arguing against possibility. You are not demanding proof in advance. You are not closing yourself off as a form of self-protection. You are simply present. This presence is where faith actually operates. Faith was never meant to override reality. It was meant to engage it without internal contradiction. Once the sabotaging pattern loosens, something else becomes visible. How much energy was being spent maintaining restraint? You realize that holding back was not neutral, it was effortful. You were constantly regulating yourself, limiting expectation, dampening hope, staying emotionally guarded. When that regulation eases, you feel lighter. Not euphoric, not empowered, just less burdened. This is alignment beginning to form. Jesus often described this as rest. Not rest from activity, but rest from strain. Come to me, all who are weary. The weariness he spoke of was not caused by life alone. It was caused by internal division. People were tired of trying to believe while protecting themselves from belief. Alignment resolves that tension. But it does not do so instantly. It emerges gradually through repeated moments where you do not retreat into the old posture. You stay engaged when you would normally withdraw. You remain open when you would normally close off. You delay judgment when you would normally conclude. These moments may feel insignificant. They are not. They are the moments where the internal system updates itself. The mind learns not through instruction, but through experience. Each time you stay present without bracing for disappointment, you provide new data. Data that contradicts the old conclusion. The old conclusion was, I must protect myself by expecting less. The new data is, I can remain open without immediate collapse. This is how alignment builds. Not through affirmations, not through declarations, but through lived coherence. Jesus' miracles functioned this way. They were not proofs meant to convince the intellect, They were interruptions of expectation. They created experiences that forced the mind to revise its assumptions. But most of the time, alignment forms without miracles. It forms in the ordinary, in how you respond to uncertainty, in how you wait, in how you interpret delay. Delay is especially important. Previously, delay confirmed the pattern. It meant, here we go again. But once alignment begins, delay becomes neutral information. It no longer automatically implies failure. This is a major shift. It means time no longer works against you internally. Before, time intensified doubt. Now, time simply exists. This does not mean impatience disappears. It means impatience no longer dictates interpretation. This is subtle but profound. Faith begins to feel less like something you must defend and more like something you inhabit. You are no longer constantly checking whether it is working. That constant checking was a form of anxiety disguised as vigilance. Alignment reduces the need to monitor outcomes, not because outcomes no longer matter, but because your internal state is no longer contingent on immediate confirmation. Jesus operated from this place. He moved without urgency, without panic, without needing validation, not because he was indifferent, but because he was internally aligned. Alignment produces calm authority. Not authority over others, but authority over reaction. You respond rather than react. Reaction belongs to patterns. Response belongs to alignment. As alignment grows, another shift occurs. Your imagination changes. Previously, imagination rehearsed failure. It prepared you emotionally for disappointment. It played out familiar endings. Now, imagination becomes quieter. Not because it suddenly imagines success, but because it stops compulsively simulating outcomes. This quiet is important. A noisy imagination is usually defensive. It is constantly scanning for threat, replaying past experiences, projecting future pain. When the mind feels safer internally, imagination settles. This settling creates space, and space allows new possibilities to arise naturally, not forced, not fabricated. Jesus often withdrew into silence, not to escape people, but to maintain alignment. Silence was not absence, it was coherence. Most people fear silence because silence removes distraction, and distraction is how patterns hide. But once the pattern weakens, silence becomes supportive rather than threatening. You are no longer afraid of what will arise internally because you are not being pulled in opposing directions. This is when prayer changes. Prayer stops being an attempt to convince or compensate. It becomes a place of alignment. You are no longer praying against yourself. You are no longer asking while expecting refusal. You are simply engaging. This does not guarantee outcomes, but it changes the quality of movement. And quality matters more than quantity. Jesus never measured faith by intensity. He measured it by coherence. A small movement, fully aligned, carries more weight than a large movement divided internally. This is why he spoke of mustard seeds. Not because faith must be small, but because faith must be whole. Wholeness is what produces growth. As alignment strengthens, you may notice something surprising. Resistance still appears, but it has less authority. The old thoughts return, but they feel less convincing, less compelling. You hear them, but you do not automatically obey them. This is a critical transition. It means the pattern no longer governs, it merely suggests. Suggestion without authority is powerless. This is not suppression. Suppression gives resistance energy. This is disengagement. You are no longer invested in arguing with the old conclusion. You see it for what it is. And outdated protection cannot compete with present clarity. This is why alignment feels peaceful. Not because life becomes simple, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. The internal civil war ends. Jesus often restored people by restoring this internal unity.
He did not add something foreign. He removed division. Your faith has made you whole. Wholeness is the opposite of internal fragmentation, and wholeness produces movement. Not frantic movement, not anxious movement, but steady movement. This is where faith becomes sustainable, not because you are strong, but because you are not divided. This stage is fragile but powerful. Fragile because old habits can return if unobserved. Powerful because alignment compounds. Each aligned decision reinforces the system. Each moment of coherence strengthens the foundation. Over time, faith stops feeling like a task. It becomes a posture, a way of standing in the world without bracing against it. This is not the end of the journey, but it is a turning point. From here, the question is no longer, why doesn't this work? The question becomes, how do I remain aligned as I move forward? That is what the next stage addresses. At this point, something important should be clear. This was never about trying harder. It was never about forcing belief, and it was never about proving faith through effort. What changes everything is alignment. When thought, expectation, and direction stop pulling against each other, movement becomes natural. Faith no longer feels like a burden you have to carry. It becomes a position you stand in. Not because all doubts disappear, not because uncertainty vanishes, but because you are no longer divided inside. Jesus never asked people to generate more faith. He invited them to stop being internally split, to see what was happening beneath the surface, to notice the quiet conclusions shaping their lives before any words were spoken or actions taken. That invitation still stands. If you have followed this entire message, it is likely because something resonated, not emotionally, but internally. Something made sense in a way that did not require convincing. That is how real understanding works. It does not shout, it aligns. You may not have all the answers yet, you may not see immediate results, but if you are more aware of your inner posture than you were before, then something fundamental has already shifted. Awareness is not the destination, but it is the gateway. Nothing changes without it. From here forward, the work is not about battling thoughts or correcting yourself. It is about staying attentive, about noticing when you begin to retreat internally, about recognizing when old protective patterns try to take control again, and instead of fighting them, you simply see them. What is seen loses power. This is how alignment is sustained, not through perfection, but through presence. Faith, when aligned, does not rush. It does not panic. It does not need constant reassurance. It moves steadily because it is no longer working against itself. That is the freedom Jesus pointed to. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom from internal contradiction. And that freedom changes everything. Not all at once, but consistently from the inside out. This series does not end here because the journey does not end here. What we've explored together is only the foundation. There is much more to uncover about how alignment reshapes decisions, relationships, purpose, and spiritual clarity in everyday life. If this message helped you see something you had never named before, then stay connected. Follow this channel. Subscribe so you do not miss the next steps in this journey. This space exists to go deeper, not louder, not faster, but clearer. Each new message builds on this understanding, helping you remain aligned in a world that constantly pulls you in different directions. If this resonated, take a moment now, subscribe, stay with us, and continue this process of clarity and transformation, not by force, but by understanding. Alignment begins with awareness, and awareness grows with consistency. Stay here. There is more ahead.